Kia ora e te whānau. My name is Hannah. I'm from the New Zealand Institute of Building, welcoming you to today's episode of Industry Insights. We're very lucky to have our special guest, Rebecca Cicco, all the way from Adelaide, a woman of very many hats. I'm just going to pass over to Rebecca to introduce herself.
Thanks, Hannah. So yeah, my name is Rebecca Cicco. I'm essentially based in Adelaide, South Australia at the moment, but I spent quite a few years, many years of my professional career in the UK, where I worked as an architect and moved into digital I think, once there was a little bit more kind of momentum regarding the BIM policy in the UK, and I was involved in many different initiatives over there before starting my own business, Digital Node, which essentially was a strategic advisory entity which supported the industry in the application of BIM and digital engineering. I did return to Australia only recently, but in my time in the UK, with the uptake of BIM and the government policy and the development of standards, I was able to be quite a prominent figure in that space, speaking at industry events and being involved in user groups in regard to the application of BIM in the United Kingdom. So moving back to Australia was interesting, to say the least, and I think we'll talk about the digital maturity on this side of the world shortly. But essentially, I did grow the business to a point where the business was acquired by Oricon in 2021, and I now act as the principal of the Digital Enablement Advisory Group within Oricon, offering very similar services as per my previous business. And I guess the final thing to touch on is, aside from obviously the different groups that I'm involved in regard to both the development and application of industry standards, such as ISO 19650, which we'll discuss today, I'm also the chair and founder of Women in BIM, a diversity group that I founded over a decade ago in the UK to respond to the low representation of women and gender minorities in the digital construction space. So thanks, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and we really appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule and to join us here. So in the next 45 minutes, we will be talking about themes such as the current state of the industry, capabilities and future skill requirements, diversity, and a bit of a session on, as Rebecca said, ISO 19650, which I've managed to get down packed now. I also just want to remind everyone that part of our Industry Insights offering is that today is a chance for you to ask Rebecca here and now your questions. So on each of the slides that will come up, we'll have a Slido code. So if you just go to slido.com, it will come up and it'll say enter your code and just enter that number there. The number is 5785714. Rebecca is really keen to take any of your questions, and yeah, so we can do that throughout the session. Right, let's get started. So our first topic is current maturity in the industry, and I think Rebecca, you were going to give us a holistic view on where the industry is at currently and your viewpoint for here in New Zealand, Australia, and then wider abroad. So I'll pass that to you.
I guess to start with, it's important to reflect on the fact that there are obviously different pockets of expertise in the different countries of the world. We know that there are more mature organisations than others. We know that there are obviously some organisations that are really struggling with digital and others that are embracing and moving very quickly. But I guess what we've and I've really been passionate about in the last 15 or so years is understanding, I guess, how we measure the maturity of a particular region. And one of the parameters for that is really the application of not just the technology that supports the built environment, but the application of the industry standards. And we saw, obviously in the UK, many of you have probably read about the application of the BIM policy, which was previously known as BIM level 2. So in the UK, the BIM policy was announced, or a strategy around it was announced over a decade ago, 2011, and industry standards were developed to support that policy, to ensure that the industry had a method for applying a consistent approach toward BIM and digital. So there were a series of PAS documents that were developed over there, and they did essentially help the industry understand how, and that was really, I guess, a strong parameter to assess the fact that the UK were very much moving ahead, although in Europe there were other regions that were applying BIM and digital in different ways. And we did see over that period from around 2013, probably over the last, I'd say, I don't know, 10 years, but really between 2013 to 2018, we saw the application of those UK standards in other regions of the world, which I guess allowed us to decipher that it was very much a progressive region, the UK. We saw the PAS 1192 series being used in Australia, Europe, Asia, New Zealand, etc. And for this reason, there was, I guess, an assumption that the UK were, miles ahead, and, there was a strategic push. But what I have seen, I guess, in the last probably 5 years with the application of international standards, which we'll get onto later, is that Australia and New Zealand have very much moved ahead in terms of the adoption of BIM and digital at a strategic level. So we are seeing large infrastructure asset owners apply consistencies to their processes, essentially, and utilize the technology to back that up. So I guess without kind of summarizing every, region of the world, I think, in Australia and New Zealand, we are still getting our head around where we need to be. But I think in terms of maturity, there's still a long way to go. And we can move through that as we move through today's chat, Hannah.
Yeah. And I just have a question around, we're starting to adapt it. Is this the bigger companies? I guess, what is the setup? We've got some of our members are part of smaller organizations, smaller businesses. What's sort of the uptake, maybe in Australia, not so much New Zealand, of smaller businesses taking up BIM and implementing that?
I think that the challenge is that a lot of companies are shifting toward BIM technologies and utilizing BIM technologies, but not embracing the BIM process, the overarching BIM process. So, for example, they're using, the varying platforms, Revit, etc., and they are trying to adopt a kind of information modeling mentality. However, we are seeing that the larger companies have a bit more sophistication in their application because they need to, because they're being forced to by their clients, right? So I think that's the challenge, the large entities, the large asset owners, large clients that own multiple assets very much are embracing that digital space, whereas, the smaller clients aren't kind of mandating or pushing that for their supply chain. So there is still a real risk of our industry falling behind, primarily because the small businesses, which is the largest market really in our sector, just aren't being pushed to deliver in that way.
So who do you see as the one leading that way? How can, somewhere like New Zealand, is it these big companies that have to kind of say, this is great, we've started implementing this, you need to do this? Or is it government? Is it everyone?
Look, I guess I can only compare it to what I saw happen overseas in the UK, where the government were very strategic in their approach toward how the industry would approach, the implementation of BIM. And that was essentially saying, okay, we've got an industry, we've got a huge market here, we've got companies of varying sizes, we've got an SME market, a small to medium enterprise market, which is 1 to 10 employees. We need to address that. And what the government did was they funded what was known as the BIM task group, which essentially then acted as a conduit for education to industry to apply the different principles and standards across the industry, including the small businesses. So regardless of what anyone says, I think there needs to be that kind of governmental approach, that policying approach. And we are seeing it in some government entities and some, like I said, some large infrastructure owners, both in New Zealand and Australia, but it's not a consistent approach. And I think that's where the challenge lies.
And in terms of students that are going through university at the moment, is BIM a large part of what they learn, I'm just thinking about when, is this something that people have to pick up once they're in a job, or, is it becoming the norm that, this is going to be how it's run in the future? Got to learn how to be part of the team.
I think there's a varying approaches toward curriculum and education in regard to universities, because again, what I saw and what I'm seeing overseas and in Australia now is, the development of postgraduate study for BIM/19650, and there is very strong uptake for ensuring that there are, I guess, avenues to be able to enter careers in this space, because unfortunately, undergraduate degrees are still lacking in terms of the curriculum that supports this new way of working, the way that we utilize the process and the strategy rather than just the technology, because the technology can be learned, right? We know that, the technologies, not that it's easy, but, there's a lot of work and reporting around how the future of skills in all sectors will be around this, strategic thinking and innovative thinking rather than, the application of, different technologies. So it is varied, I think, Hannah. And again, that's another risk that we face, not having enough people with the skills to be able to deliver on these requirements.
Absolutely. And that's probably a good segue into our next point about capability. We had a brief discussion on Monday about what to discuss here, and I think it seems like you're pretty passionate about this aspect of the role and strategies and growing these skills, determining capabilities. So can you just sort of outline what's important to you to grow these skills, to determine these skills?
Yeah, I guess I'll contextualize it to start with in regard to my level of expertise. So I worked very, very, very hard to ensure that I was fluent in the kind of BIM policy overseas, because I knew that there would be, and I saw them be the standards in the UK being referenced in government documents all over the world. So I knew that there would be an opportunity in regard to developing curriculum and supporting organizations in upskilling, because that was a huge concern overseas when we first saw the BIM policy introduced, was, how are we going to get all of these people upskilled and on the same page? There's, millions of people in the construction industry. There are, very, very few that understand any of this. So what I was fortunate enough to be involved in with the BIM task group and the varying institutions overseas, one of them being the Chartered Institute of Building in the UK, where I sit as a fellow, was the development of learning outcomes and curriculum frameworks for curriculum, which included not only how universities would approach curriculum, but also how industry would develop training to support BIM. So there are a series of learning outcomes which have now been updated, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. But there's I guess the UK BIM framework now have their learning outcomes framework, which essentially defines a consistent approach as to what skills are needed and what learning is needed for the industry. So I developed a whole series of training courses for the likes of the Chartered Institute of Building, British Standards Institute, etc. And that was also a driver for me in terms of developing training courses to support this capability piece. And again, I guess to reiterate, not the technology training, the awareness around technology, certainly, but the application of the strategic process in regard to how a business would set themselves up to be BIM enabled or digitally enabled, how they would ensure that there was I guess, a strategy around continuous improvement, and then obviously proof to their clients that they had the right people to deliver on what their clients were asking for. Because one of the other things, and I'm jumping a bit, in the UK was that through procurement, pre-qualification questionnaires were including questions around BIM and digital. You know, what is your organizational maturity? Have you developed key documents in your business, like the BIM execution plan? What is your strategy as a business to upskilling? So all of the businesses that I worked with in the UK really were very focused on developing strategies to support building capability. And I guess that was a huge driver again over here. I'm seeing the same patterns occur on this side of the world, Australia and New Zealand, where organizations are now saying, well, how do we prove that we've got these skills, you know?
Yeah.
And that's a huge question. You know, it's a huge challenge for many businesses, not just government driving it, but, you know, small businesses that are looking at developing their skills to be able to offer services to be able to grow and develop their you know, their portfolios, you know. So yeah, it's really interesting space to work in.
Yeah. You spoke a bit about, so I mean, this seems to be a large part of your framework and what you do. Are you able to sort of talk about some projects and some strategies, some examples? I'm sure our listeners would be really interested to hear how they can sort of start thinking about implementing some changes. And
absolutely. And I think the first step and what I've seen in different businesses is determining where you need your business to move to and what those digital capabilities look like. So in regard to you know, the type of work you deliver, the type of projects that you have, the type of, obviously, the scale of the projects, and obviously the discipline, right? So understanding what digital capabilities that you will need is the first step. And those digital capabilities could be, you know, I need leadership skills around, you know, the strategic piece. I need 3D modeling or information modeling skills. I need computational design skills, etc. So once those skills have been mapped, then I guess the first step is understanding what is the current situation. So one of our clients that we're working with, a medium-sized tier 2 contractor who are delivering building projects. We've been working with them for about 4 years, and I guess the framework or the strategy around that engagement was understanding the existing conditions of that business in regard to capability, developing a framework for upskilling, which would include a tiered approach, almost as a staged approach to learning, and then developing training curriculum to support that learning, and then obviously continually assessing staff to ensure that there is a circular continuous improvement. So what that looks like was that we had a group of people in that business that were chosen to sit within a pilot for this capability program, and we developed I guess digital assessments where we were, you know, similar to surveys, where we were sending these assessments out to a group of people to understand their current skills. And once we had an understanding of those current skills, they were then mapped to I guess a tiered approach to training. So from level 1, 2, and 3, and level 1 was very high level. Why is it important? You know, an overview of the 19650 standards, an overview of the technology piece. Level 2 was around applications. So how to apply BIM to projects, utilizing some of the technologies, developing some of the documentation, such as your BIM execution plan and other documents, and even reviewing model data across projects. And then level 3 was that advanced piece. So ensuring that there was I guess a strategic understanding, a practical review or application of BIM on projects or digital engineering, and then developing all of the documentation to support that. So once we had all of that in place, we were then able to continuously assess people to ensure that there was a constant movement between the levels. So people were starting off at level 1, moving into level 2, etc. And they were all mapped against their roles and the skills required for their roles, which was also an elaborate task. So I guess there's a lot of work to be done, but essentially it's not just about picking, a group of people and throwing them into a BIM course. It's really about strategically acknowledging where is it that where do the skills need to be in my business, and what are those skills? And then how do I ensure people are continually growing in terms of their level of learning?
Yeah. I guess a question that is on the top of my mind is, this space is kind of ever growing, moving very quickly. The training that happened, like, is this something that has to be kind of updated a lot, or, moving with the times to ensure everyone is kind of in the know of what's going on?
Yeah, so interestingly, we started, one of our clients, we started pre-19650. So we had to update all of our content to reflect some of the terminologies, which is, a huge challenge in the industry, but also with the uptake and movement of, from BIM into digital engineering, into, the application of digital twins and smart buildings and things like that, which we can talk about. There's been, obviously, I guess a strategy around, how regularly we would update the content, and, we would do that annually for this particular client. But again, it is about ensuring that you constantly are refreshing your content. Yeah.
So, and there is a question here about, where do you get your information, your updates, what's your sort of go-to? Is there a specific website? I mean, I know you're very well connected. I'm just thinking of people who want to get into the space that maybe haven't quite taken that leap. Where should they start? Where should they start looking?
Well, I often say that, and there's obviously a lot of work that's been undertaken in the UK, but because the UK journey was essentially from the very beginning of the PAS suite, and then obviously, like I said, the BIM policy, I think there's, from my perspective, the UK BIM framework and the supporting documentation there is a good place to start, because all of the documentation and the support documents for 19650 are all embedded on that website, but they've also been used in Australia, New Zealand. I'm seeing, and referenced in Australia and New Zealand, because we're now updating all of our BIM documentation in these two countries to reflect 19650. So I think, start with the UK BIM framework. The Centre for Digital Built Britain is also an excellent resource, but also I'll often check the industry bodies' websites, like I've said, the Chartered Institute of Building and other bodies in the UK, because they're often releasing quite high level reports. But then finally, the World Economic Forum is also a good resource, because they are also updating and developing reporting around digital and focusing on digital and how that impacts different jurisdictions and governments, etc.
That's really helpful. I might email some of those key things, and we'll send that out as a follow-up, because I think in terms of New Zealand, I guess there probably will be people who are just sort of starting on that journey, or just beginning, and that information to start is quite crucial. Well, to get the right information.
Totally.
I imagine there is just so much. Well, actually, I know there's so much out there, because in my research for today, I found thousands of documents that didn't know if they were credible or not. I was trying to find the right one. So we'll send that out to the audience, because that's a very good place to start.
Great.
Is there anything else you want to cover in capability, or we might move on to diversity?
Yeah, I think we can move on, but I think the 19650 stuff is also really important to touch on, the terminologies, I think, which we'll touch on. But I guess I'll give a bit of an intro
Yes.
for the work that I do with women in BIM.
Yes.
So I did mention the World Economic Forum and all of the industry reporting, but one thing that we haven't touched on yet is that the United Nations have obviously they make recommendations for sustainability for the globe, and the United Nations have developed their sustainable development goals, which essentially are to make recommendations to the 168 member states under the UN regarding policy, process, and the greater good of the world, really. So a lot of these sustainable goals reflect poverty, access to water, hunger, and it's interesting because there are, the sustainable development goals are very important. And one of the primary goals, which I guess was a key driver for me for a long time, was Goal 5, gender equality, because it wasn't just about, the construction industry being, not very good at being diverse, but it was about the fact that gender equality is a huge fundamental global problem impacting all countries and all regions of the world, because women are still subject to obviously violence against women. There are still issues with women accessing education and being driven to different careers in different countries of the world, the Middle East, for example, and also women in government. So women sitting across managerial positions, which is very, very low. So one of the, I guess the driver for women in BIM back in 2012 was the UK, because obviously I was living there. There was some policies, as I've mentioned, and, there were a whole series of events and conferences and meetings and stuff like that I was immersed in. And there were just very few women and people of diverse backgrounds and gender minorities, which was a concern for me. So Women in BIM was founded as a response to that, but has evolved into, I guess, a global movement, because we're trying to address not only diversity in the built environment, but digital diversity and the digital capability piece, because we are lacking skills, as we know, based on our previous discussion. And we're seeing far too many women generally not engage in this space or leave the industry. So, how do we change this? I guess there's 3 key areas for women in BIM that we focus on. And the first is, how do we change the mindset and the mentality at a young age, as to what is the direction a young person would like to take in terms of their career. So we do a lot of work with groups and schools and education to support, the way that what a career in digital construction would look like. And there's a couple of programs that we're involved in. The middle piece is that support piece. So how do we support women that are already in industry that might want to pivot into a digital role, or those that are in the industry in digital from not leaving, essentially. So we have a number of projects that are in place at the moment. One of them is our mentor scheme, where we match mentors and mentees all over the world. And another is our project around roles and responsibilities and remuneration, which we're in progress at the moment to support how we define a role, what the key responsibilities look like, and then how people are remunerated to ensure there's no issue, which we know there is, around the gender pay gap. And I guess the third is that celebration of role models, right? Having role models in the industry that are senior, that are female or diverse or come from a minority gender, it's so important to encourage other people of those backgrounds to enter these careers. What you don't see, you can't be. And I think we've been saying this for years, that women in BIM, and it's broader than BIM, we know, because it's women in the digital built environment, need to be looking, the young women anyway, need to be looking at, some role models to see, where they can possibly get to. So yeah, there's a lot of work there, and I'm very passionate about this space.
Yeah, I think you know, and there's probably a lot of work to be, you know, done, which sounds like you're doing around breaking down those stereotypes that have been so ingrained. You know, I know in New Zealand, very much that whole construction, just the word construction is just such a male dominated thing that at school, you know, if you were to say a builder, or, you know, you wanted to explore this, it was, you know, it was a male's job. But this is different, isn't it? I mean, the digital side is, I mean, I guess even when you think about IT and things like that, it's celebrating that anyone can do that role. It's not a you need to be this or need to be that. And that's so great that you know, a place like Women in BIM is around for people to feel that celebration of them in the industry, and know that there is support for them ongoing.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say, I think the challenge is, you know, women in digital as a whole, because, you know, there obviously, you mentioned it, you know, in IT, there's just not that many women that are interested in, you know, moving into those careers. And that's, you know, that's a problem. I mean, it's interesting because my example is that I was always a little bit different, where I wanted to explore technology, but I was also interested in the built environment. And I was like that from before I can remember. So I was always interested. And some people say that you just kind of, it's just in you, and others are just like, there needs to be role models. And I think for me, my father was in construction, so I think that must have been the driver. But yeah, I think there needs to be more, I don't know, like more role models and people out there that are saying, okay, what's digital, what's construction, how do we merge those, and then where do you want to take your career? Because it's not all just hard hats and steel boots, right? It can be anything you want it to be.
And I think that's what I mean by, yeah, the word construction. People see it as, yeah, hard hats, you know, heavy lifting. And there's so many, and I guess I didn't know that until I, you know, was in this job, that how many roles there are within the construction industry. I mean, it is absolutely for everyone, and, you know, interesting. And you know, the digital space is just, you know, because it is growing and moving so fast, it's, you know, I guess for younger people, it is absolutely something they should hear about, because it's very much what the next generation is, that technology side, things growing, adapting, moving, you know, exciting stuff.
Yeah, and one other thing is that a lot of the conversations that we're hearing especially in the digital construction space, or women that are moving to digital roles, is just the challenge with it in terms of the constant learning. It's like, you know, and I can only give the example of myself, like the constant learning piece, right? There's always something new, right? So you're constantly challenged in regard to, you know, the way that it evolves, you know. And I think, you know, we talk about women and having kids, and I know when I had my son, you know, I never really took that much time off, because I was like petrified that, you know, I would be missing something, or I would be missing out on what was going to be, you know, changing or happening in the industry. And to be a leader and to be an expert, you know, from my perspective, it was always keeping up to speed with what was going on in the industry, and what, like we mentioned earlier, the reports, the technologies, this and that. So it is challenging, you know, it's not an easy space to work in. And I don't think, I don't think that's acknowledged as much as it could be, you know, because there's just so much to learn and constantly learn. And as a woman, that's sometimes difficult. And as a person, it's sometimes difficult, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, and even various meetings we've had with our digital hui, talking about artificial intelligence and what are these roles going to look like in the future? What are the implications of, you know, if we accept all this technology and all you know, want it to grow, what does that actually mean for the human? And how would that, I guess, you know, what would that look like in terms of a role for a woman? You know, would that be appealing to, would it be a desk job, or I'm just trying to think of what it means for the future, and what young people might think it will look like.
Well, I guess I can only give my example, but I'm at that point in my career where I know what my level of expertise is, and I'm comfortable talking about that. But I think when you're early in your career and the industry is moving so quickly, and as you say, the uptake of varying technologies and AI, it's quite scary, you know, because you don't know what is the right direction for me, and how will that be the right choice if it's moving so quickly. So I think it is about taking those risks. And I think that's just a part of life. It's understanding, you know, what is it that I'm passionate about? What do I want to look, you know, where do I want to go in terms of my career, and how do I want to address that? So it's difficult. But one of the other things, as you mentioned, AI, is that, you know, if we look at uniquely human skills, you know, uniquely human skills will never depreciate. So they won't ever be you know, not utilized. And I think that's something that we need to think about. What are those unique skills, and what do they look like? And that's really important to consider, you know, innovative thinking, analytical thinking, problem solving, etc.
Yeah. And important to note that, you know, humans will always be needed, and, you know, it just might be that roles change, and the abilities are different. So yeah, there's so many roles within the construction space.
Yeah.
Even if you entered and something changed, or your skills moved somewhere else, you know, there's space in all respects. So that's great. Let's move on to the famous ISO 19650, which I have read up a little bit on. But I really want to go to you, Rebecca, for you to tell us a little bit about, I know you've touched on it, but your history here, because I know this is your baby, where it started and where it's going now. So just give us a bit of a background.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think early in the chat, we when I lived and worked in the UK, and the 1192 series was released, which was PAS 1192 Part 2 and 3. Part 2 was released in 2013 and Part 3 in 2014. They were both the industry standards for both the delivery of a BIM project, and then the operational purposes or the operational processes regarding BIM. At that time, they were new, so nobody knew what they were. There was terminologies and references to terminologies within those documents around delivery, process, and standardization for digital projects, BIM projects. And it was really interesting because I was able to be a part of the feedback community to British Standards Institute, feeding back because I was very interested at that time when they were first released. And there was quite a small community of people at that time who were part of what was known as the BIM task group, feeding back to government and to British standards in regard to those standards, because they were very much new to the industry. So when the process for internationalization of the UK BIM standards, which was the development of the 19650 documents, I was so happy because I felt that there was going to be finally something that we could look at holistically on a global level, because I was working in multiple regions when I was running my business in Australia, the UK, New Zealand, Europe, the US, etc. I thought, you know, that before 19650 was released, you know, all of these countries were talking to 1192, you know, and it was interesting because there was they were UK standards, so they referenced UK policy and they were relating to UK contracts, and I thought, this is ridiculous. So there was, I think, excitement when 19650 was released, but I also was appointed and part of the feedback community again to BSI regarding 19650, but I was also appointed to develop training courses for British Standards Institute. So I was the first contractor to BSI to originally author all of the 19650 training courses. So at that point, when they were released, which was about 5 years later, again, there was a strong uptake of 19650 all over the world. So 19650 part 1 and 2 were released initially in 2018, and then parts 3 and 5 in 2020, and part 4 in 22. Part 6 is still yet to be released. But if you map those standards against the PAS 1192 series, they're pretty much identical in terms of the numerical relationship between them. And there's some diagrammatic content I can share after the session today. But essentially, yeah, 19650 has now been applied to most jurisdictions all over the world. And there's a lot of work at the moment being undertaken through Women in BIM, but other initiatives to look at what is the maturity of 19650 in different regions, because a lot of countries are they're just aligning, they're not mandating the use of it, they're rather aligning their documentation to it. So an example is in Australia, we have different state government policies, and those different state government policies are in alignment to 19650, but not 100% compliant, if that makes sense. So there's still some challenges, but we know that the BIM in NZ group and the digital HUI stuff that I've been involved in, there's some obviously updates being undertaken at the moment to the New Zealand BIM handbook to align to 19650. And I know that an example is Kiwi Rail, who are very much in alignment for their digital engineering framework to 19650. So there's an appetite, there's an understanding, and there is a maturity starting to develop in New Zealand and Australia around the 19650 standards.
And is there, because, you talk about the alignment as opposed to it being, what you have to do, is there a next step that will come when it is, that you have to use these processes, or is that, is it always going to be you choose?
That's a good question. I would hope there would be, but I've been saying that for years and that hasn't happened. So I think there's I think the appointing party, e.g. the entity that is the asset owner, the procurer of the industry services, that entity, whoever that is, infrastructure client, buildings client, whatever it is, will need to be strategic in their approach toward 19650. And I think from my, when I think about it again, is it that important? Yes, because industry are continually confusing terminologies and processes, and there's a whole issue around, how we are developing our information, in what formats and how we're sharing that information, how we're accessing that information, etc. And this is where 19650 says, okay, let's do that in a way that can consistently be applied, So, yeah, we'll see.
That, and you make a good point there about the terminology, the language, and you mentioned before that we're working on a project, which is the DigiGuide, Digital BIM guidance project with the Construction Sector Accord, and a large part of the conversation that I've been a part of with all the subject matter expertise is around that language, that key, all those defining points, and being able to kind of break this information down, because there is a lot, and also the differences between sort of overseas and what terminology is being used, so that we're all kind of on the same page.
Yeah,
which is
absolutely.
why the BIM handbook is at a critical stage to be updated, so that people can really use ISO, the way that it's intended to be used, right?
Exactly. And it's important because, like I said, varying policies and jurisdictions across the world are starting to implement BIM and digital engineering, and they are looking toward, that's the framework. 19650 is the methodology, and to trade between different regions. I mean, skills shortages are of paramount importance at the moment, and we need to be able to cross-contaminate skills across different regions, and without a consistent approach, that just won't happen.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I've got so carried away that we're almost out of time, but just quickly, what's next for you, Rebecca? What's next for you? What's next for Oricon?
Yeah. Look, I think our focus, our focus is, how do we ensure that we're continually evolving, in terms of the next digital evolution, or the wave of digital skills and future skills. And, we're really focusing on what those future skills look like, and how we can evolve our services and our offering to support those future skills, how, AI will impact our business, how our business should be 100% compliant to 19650, which it's, getting there. And, what is it that we need to be doing to ensure that industry as a whole are being more innovative, more diverse, and evolving the way that they need to, because, there's still, many laggards, we call them, it's kind of running behind and not keeping up with what we need to be doing in terms of innovating our industry. So yeah, for me, it's a little bit of digital, a little bit of diversity, and a little bit of innovation kind of mixed all together.
Oh, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah. And I think, this was maybe the bit of the pep talk that New Zealand needs to kind of, get excited about what's next, and really look into, these updates. And so I think it'll be important to get what you talked about earlier, of where to get this information, so people can start getting excited and seeing the change. So yeah, thank you for your time today, Rebecca. I really appreciate it. And
thanks, Hannah.
Just all the members out there, on the 2nd of August, we've got Damon Otto and Lisa Oliver on the next episode. So please go online and register for that. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining today, and this will be available online on our resources page in the next week or so. Yeah, please go on our events page and register for events that are coming up. And yeah, we'll see you all soon. Ka kite anō.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks.
Bye.